Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor.
I'm Ben Rhodes.
All right, Ben, let's start with Saudi Arabia. So the backstory for folks is that in October of 2018, a Saudi Arabian dissident and journalist named Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey. It was pretty much immediately clear that Khashoggi was killed by the Saudi government, and news outlets quickly reported that U.S. intelligence believed that this hit was ordered by the top, by the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS. MBS, for listeners, he's the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. He's next in line to be king. The Trump administration, Trump himself, covered up MBS's role in this killing. They refused to provide Congress with information about the murder, despite being legally obligated to. Bob Woodward later quoted Trump saying he had, quote, saved MBS's ass, end quote. During the campaign, President Biden said that MBS was responsible for Khashoggi's death and that the Saudis would be held responsible. Let's play a clip of that.
President Trump has not punished senior Saudi leaders. Would you?
Yes, and I said it at the time. Khashoggi was, in fact, murdered and dismembered, and I believe in the order of the Crown Prince. And I would make it very clear, we were not going to, in fact, sell more weapons to them. We were going to, in fact, make them pay the price and make them, in fact, the pariah that they are. There's very little social redeeming value in the present government in Saudi Arabia. And I would also, as pointed out, I would end the subsidies that we have, end the sale of material to the Saudis, who they're going in and murdering children and they're murdering innocent people. And so they have to be held accountable.
Obviously, that was candidate Biden. He wasn't yet in control of the intelligence community. Now he is. And last week, Biden's intelligence team released a declassified report about the killing, the one that Trump had suppressed. And it unequivocally stated that MBS approved the Khashoggi assassination. Some of the evidence includes the fact that 7 members of the assassination team were part of MBS's personal security detail. So as punishment, State Department announced sanctions on 76 Saudis. They created a new category of sanctions called the Khashoggi ban that will ban visas to anyone linked to the repression, detention of dissidents and journalists. But here's the problem. MBS himself wasn't punished in any way. So, Ben, administration officials said Biden was worried about punishing MBS because it could sever ties with the guy who's positioned to lead the country for decades. It might make it harder to cooperate on Iran. That one I don't really understand at all. And they point out that historically the U.S. has not sanctioned leaders of countries that we have relations with, like Putin in Russia, Xi Jinping in China. Of course, we have sanctioned the shit out of leaders in Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and other places. They also point out that the Biden administration has previously announced the end of U.S. support for Saudi Arabia's offensive military operations in Yemen and a freeze on arms sales. So, Ben, a lot of context there, but let's pause here. I found this very disappointing. I know you did too, because I read your Twitter. I think Mohammed bin Salman deserves to be punished for his actions, treated like a global pariah. The Khashoggi family deserves some measure of justice here. But it is bigger than just this case, right? Because there are reports that the Saudis sent another group of assassins to Canada to try to kill a former intelligence official there. So this is something they've repeated. And clearly MBS and his crew are just acting with impunity. I'm not pretending this is an easy set of issues, but the outcome seems to have disappointed most people. What was your reaction to this decision, and what do you think the penalty should have been for MBS or the Saudis more broadly?
Yeah, well, look, I think they do deserve credit for releasing the assessment. They've definitely made good on their promise to halt support to the war in Yemen. The arms sales piece is a bit ambiguous. They've kind of halted it, reviewing. They're trying to draw distinctions between offensive and defensive weapons, which is not quite as simple as it sounds. So TBD. I think the thing that's concerning to me is twofold. One, the general, and the other the specific. The general issue of, he's the de facto leader of Saudi Arabia. He's likely to be the king of Saudi Arabia for a long time. And we need the Saudis, so therefore we can't risk this relationship. I question the premise of that. What do we need them for that badly? In the sense of the arguments given were we need to work with them to counter Iran. Well, it's the Saudis who want us.
What did you make of that, right?
It's such a blobby argument because it's a self-fulfilling circle, because the Saudis want us to do more to confront Iran on their behalf. And so then we have to do more to confront Iran to make the Saudis happy, but we need them in order to do that. Like it's a failure sometimes in the American foreign policy establishment to step back and question underlying assumptions. We are the stronger party in this relationship. By the way, we used to depend on them to supply a lot of oil to the global economy. Well, that's less and less important as we shift towards clean energy. The U.S. has surpassed Saudi Arabia as even a producer. And the reality there, too, is it's not like the Saudis are going to stop selling oil on the global market to get back at America. That would hurt them. So I question that assumption generally. But then the specifics of, well, by going out and saying we don't want to sanction leaders, what kind of message are you sending to MBS? Because you're kind of saying we will never sanction. If you can't sanction somebody for killing a U.S. resident who works at the Washington Post in your consulate, if that doesn't cross the threshold, what would? Is there anything that someone could do? And so I think that's the logic question. In terms of what they could have done, I think, look, you're not going to freeze MBS's assets. That's a little complicated. The guy's sitting on $1 trillion, right? He's sitting on the Saudi National Oil Company, the sovereign wealth fund that is deeply invested in the American economy. I get the difficulty of, say, trying to somehow impose a financial penalty on someone who has bottomless financial resources. But a travel ban, saying that this guy can't travel to the United States, that's a personal consequence he faces. And saying publicly that Joe Biden will not meet with him, will not deal with him. You could say that other U.S. officials wouldn't necessarily deal with him either. That would have a cost because it would indicate that, this guy, we're not going to afford him the same, privileges that we would leaders who haven't murdered journalists, who are U.S.-based journalists, U.S. persons. That's where I think that there was an opportunity missed. There's something in between, like a full sanction type policy and a direct personal consequence to MBS. And I think this idea of what is his status, what is his travel status, is an area that they could have pursued.
Yeah, former CIA director John Brennan, who was, lived in Saudi Arabia multiple times, suggested a similar thing. So that Biden audio that we played for you guys was from a Democratic debate. Later on in that same answer, Biden says, quote, "We must make it clear that we stand for human rights. We should be going to the United Nations seeking condemnation of China, what they're doing with 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps." He also mentioned Hong Kong. I think that's another key point here, right? Like, China is watching. Russia is watching. They are constantly assessing whether there's a cost for human rights violations. And my guess is this decision will lead them to believe they'll get a pass. I'm not suggesting that we should sanction Xi Jinping necessarily, or that it would be simple to do so. But, it does, candidate Biden and President Biden don't seem totally synced up here.
Well, there's a specific issue of like leaders where I've expressed a lot of skepticism of sanctions, particularly these broad sanctions that target the population. But you know what? Individual leaders, like increasingly, as we've had this drift towards like nationalism and authoritarianism, are increasingly responsible for very specific things, like killing Jamal Khashoggi or like poisoning Alexei Navalny. And I'm not sure why, why is it okay to sanction the whole population of Cuba or the whole population of Iran, but not a leader? When oftentimes U.S. sanctions hurt innocent people, we might as well focus them on people who are guilty. I was thinking a lot, if I was in government, I'd be the Biden people. I'm sure they're frustrated with people like us, and that they're thinking, look, we're trying to do something important here. We're trying to change the Saudi relationship. We're not Trump. We're not giving them a blank check. We're suspending these arms sales and reviewing them. We've stopped our support for the war in Yemen. And they've committed to this kind of human rights mechanism to protect journalists. And I have to say, like, if they follow through on all those things, that's hugely important and should not get lost in the kind of political controversy over this one decision. That said, I learned from the Obama years that sometimes these symbolic events, they really matter, And I think an analogy I used with you on our text chain, Tommy, is that we canceled a meeting with the Dalai Lama that Obama was supposed to have in 2009. And because he was going to go to China, and we didn't want to have a really disruptive meeting with the Dalai Lama to kind of sour those relations. And so we went, and we had a lot of criticism, and we got very defensive, and we said, don't you see, we're trying to actually impact the Chinese, and this is a better way to do it. But you know what? That was wrong, because early in the Obama administration, we sent a message through that not meeting with the Dalai Lama that that we seemed to be willing to adjust our behavior on a human rights issue because of the political difficulty of it. And so I think people have to recognize that, yeah, this sent a message. It was an early kind of test of where will they weigh human rights and democracy type issues related to other priorities. And it's impossible, even if it wasn't their intention, it's impossible to not draw the conclusion that there was a kind of, old line realist calculation made to not do something that they probably wanted to do, but in sanctioning MBS, but concluded they couldn't. And yeah, you're right that there's no doubt that that's a message.
Yeah, I have enormous sympathy for all of these issues being hard. Yeah. I can imagine the Situation Room meeting where, generals with 4 stars on their shoulder talk about how we need the Saudis for a variety of reasons. The intelligence community talks about their critical cooperation on AQAP in dealing with Al Qaeda, and they're all right, right? But this got built up as being about something bigger and about U.S. values and protecting journalists and the right to free expression. And I think that people are understandably a little bummed out by the outcome. Also, right before we started taping today, Tuesday, the Biden administration declassified a report that said the FSB, a Russian intelligence agency, orchestrated the attempted assassination of opposition leader Alexei Navalny, and the Biden team sanctioned members of the Russian government. They didn't sanction Putin. They didn't sanction Russia's top intelligence chiefs, presumably for the same set of reasons, right? We have to meet with them, work with them on things. But these sanctions essentially mirror steps that have been taken by countries in Europe. So, they are taking action against these sorts of violations and at least naming and shaming the people involved.
Look, across the board, this is a huge improvement from where we were. And I'd say, I've often thought that, MBS probably wouldn't have done what he did with Jamal Khashoggi if there was a Joe Biden as president or Barack Obama or frankly anybody. So it's not like an Obama point. It's just Trump. He knew he had such impunity with Jared Kushner sucking up to MBS and Trump hugging the guy that he could do this. I do think it matters that the U.S. now is putting some guardrails around these issues. That said, I think that given the backsliding around democracy in the world, given the aggressive challenge to democracy in this country and from China and Russia around the world, there has to be kind of a paradigm shift where the way in which human rights have been dealt with in American foreign policy in recent history, certainly, it's always kind of secondary to some other interest, a counterterrorism interest, an economic interest, a climate change interest. And if people know that it's something you care about, but it's something you care less about than something else, they're not going to take it quite as seriously as if you put human rights on the same plateau as those other interests. And that's asking a lot of the Biden team to make that paradigm shift. And I don't claim that we made it in the Obama years. I think at times we did, but at other times we certainly didn't. But I kind of feel like that's what, if you really want to revitalize democracy around the world and you really want to engage in this kind of battle on behalf of civil society and journalists and democracy activists, people need to see you do it when it's hard, not just do the sanctions that are expected but when are you willing to make a trade-off and say, you know what, we will suffer a bit of consequences with the Saudis if we take this route, but we're willing to do that. And that would send a message. This is changing. This is different. So credit to Biden on moving the paradigm back to caring about these things and raising them and being a spotlight on them and being a source of accountability. But I truly think that the time has come to go further to where you're elevating human rights to the same prioritization that you put on other things.
Yeah. Let's turn to Syria and Iraq because last week the U.S. carried out airstrikes in eastern Syria against buildings and individuals it said were associated with Iranian-backed militia groups that were operating in Iraq. The Pentagon said that this strike was in response to a rocket attack on American and coalition personnel that happened in mid-February. That attack killed a Filipino contractor and it wounded 6 others, including 5 Americans. Biden's team described the strikes to press as, relatively small. They told reporters that President Biden chose the most limited of the options he was presented because he didn't want to escalate hostilities, especially with Iran. Several Democrats criticized the strike and they questioned the legal basis for it. I reached out to the Pentagon about that legal authorities question, and they pointed to the president's Article 2 authority to defend U.S. personnel and deter risk from future attacks. They also pointed to the right of self-defense under international law. So, Ben, I think we could just take this in two parts. First is this legal question, right? Like, members of Congress are absolutely right that offensive military action has not been authorized in Syria. We need a new AUMF. Tim Kaine, Chris Murphy, lots of Democrats have been talking about this. I also think we should question whether retaliation against these groups, these militia groups, actually deters them, right? He's like, it might, but we were told that assassinating Qasem Soleimani, the Iranian general, would deter Iran and would deter these militia groups when Trump killed him back in January of 2020, but it hasn't. But I guess the question is, what do you do if you have forces in Iraq that are getting attacked by these militia groups that are operating just over the border in Syria, right? Like, you don't want a situation like you have in Afghanistan where the Taliban have this safe haven in Pakistan and can operate there with impunity and then attack your folks. Like, it feels like a similarly tough problem.
Yeah, this is a hard problem. On the legal question, look, obviously this comes to the fore through this individual strike, but there's really just a bigger issue. And the bigger issue is that U.S. troops are in all these places and doing all these things, whether it's Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, under these authorities that were given to them in 2001 and 2002 by Congress, And so it's been like 20 years since we've had a real revised AUMF, authorization for the use of military force, from Congress. That needs to happen. And so I know the Biden team is doing COVID relief, and you can understand they're juggling a lot of things. But I think some of the agitation from Congress is just, hey, we need you guys to send up a new AUMF, or we need to negotiate with you on a new authorization for the use of military force. Less about this one strike and more about just what is the legal rationale for all of our military engagements in the Middle East and South Asia.
It's important.
It's important. And then the other thing that caught my attention is, look, there's been these proxy attacks from Iranian-backed militias or groups inside of Iraq on U.S. forces, on U.S. Contractors that we're working with, on Iraqi forces, and there are often U.S. military reprisals. I think what was different is that this was in Syria. And that was different. That kind of the first time I saw
by design too, right? Because they said they didn't want to upset the Iraqi government or create a political problem for them.
Well, and by design, but I remember when I saw the news alert, it took me, I did a kind of a double take because I saw the reprisal for what happened inside of Iraq, and I assumed that we had bombed somebody in Iraq, In the Obama years, even as we had the counter-ISIS campaign in Syria, we did not go after Iranian-backed militias inside of Syria. That's a different target. And in some ways there's an escalation and saying that we're now fighting Iran in Syria as well as in Iraq. And so, that does merit scrutiny, and I think Congress is right to ask questions. They may have a clear rationale. And I think if you listen to the Biden team, they were clearly trying to indicate that this is not meant to be some big escalation. They chose a site that's on the border, on the Iraqi-Syria border. They went out of their way to say it wasn't the biggest, most robust strike option available to them. But you can't get around the fact that they took their first strike in Syria, not in Iraq, doing something that was not, the norm in the Obama years when we also had these kinds of attacks. By the way, not even the norm in the Trump years. The Israelis often hit Iranian-backed targets inside of Syria. The U.S. usually doesn't. So I can see, we can see the intelligence. If they think they had to do it to protect our forces, again, that should be scrutinized by Congress. But I would be concerned if this becomes a regular kind of escalatory cycle where suddenly we're fighting a proxy war in Syria as well as Iraq and everything else.
I did the exact same double take. I got a text from a friend about what had happened, and I assumed it was in Iraq, and I didn't really read the full story initially, and then realized that the strike was in Syria, and realized it's actually a far bigger deal than I realized. The other thing just worth pointing out is we've all, I think, just gotten so numb to and used to there being military activity in the region that I'm not sure if you caught 60 Minutes over the weekend, but they did a segment on Iran's response to the assassination of Qasem Soleimani back in January of 2020. when the Iranians fired 11 ballistic missiles with 1,000-pound warheads at Al-Assad Air Base in Iraq. And like some of the men and women serving there had cleared out. Others were left sheltering in bunkers that were just insufficient for weapons of that size. And the takeaway from this report was it was a miracle that U.S. service members didn't die. It is a miracle that the fighting didn't escalate into an even bigger conflict. It's really worth watching the piece. They have drone footage of the missiles striking our base, and you can see just how close we came. They talked to the men and women who lived through it, some of whom still have traumatic brain injuries and are suffering to this day. Like these are not insignificant actions. You know, I think that was like the big takeaway. And I think you have to live through that experience to fully understand it the way they did.
Yeah, and I will say too that it's a fascinating piece, and there are great things about it. I also though think in that piece they were a little too credulous. You know, the claim was made that there was intelligence Soleimani was going to strike our troops in days. That's not what we learned at the reporting at the time or from Congress. And
they stopped asserting that.
Yeah, and CBS didn't really push back. You know, so but which by the way proves the point of like there's usually just a kind of we take at face value that there's tit for tat military action in this region, and you don't kind of scrutinize the basis. We challenged, you know, and said at the time that intelligence should be made available to Congress. I think the Biden administration, from what I hear, has done the right thing in providing that basis to Congress, and we have not heard any complaints, which would suggest that in this case there really was a tie between this militia group and this target and what had happened to U.S. forces. But you're right, like, and if you tally up kind of a few things that have been happening recently where there's been this, you know, the Iranians have not responded to the offer of diplomacy over the nuclear program. Frankly, the Biden administration appears to be pretty hawkish heading into that diplomacy. They are talking about needing to counter Iran and the decision not to sanction MBS. Now we had this strike on Iranian-backed militia. Just because Biden doesn't want to have a conflict with Iran doesn't mean, as you point out, Tommy, that an event couldn't intervene that leads to an escalation.
Yeah. Well,
you know,
let's talk about this broader set of issues with Iran, because you previewed it well. I mean, last week, like you mentioned, Iran rejected the European Union's offer to hold direct nuclear talks with the U.S. because Iran wants, still, they've said it many times, they want some sort of guarantee that those talks would lead to sanctions relief. Iran has also proposed having the EU serve as some sort of mediator to broker a process that would lead each side to making concessions. But so, Ben, the thing that's really jumping out at me is that the clock is ticking, right? Because there's a presidential election in June. Hassan Rouhani, the president of Iran, he's term limited out of the job. He can't run again. So we don't know if the next president will be a hardliner, will be someone more moderate. I mean, odds are if history passes prologue, it'll be a hardliner. You know, so you have the Biden team taking a pretty hawkish position. Republicans are demanding an even more hawkish position, right? They want the negotiations to tackle all of Iran's malign activities. How worried are you about this upcoming Iranian election and like the possibility that Iranian politics could get in the way of a deal?
Well, there's no question, you know, that there's always a risk that the Iranians will be intransigent about negotiations, about returning to the deal. Again, I also think, so what does the U.S. control? I mean, I think, you know, Chris Murphy spoke about this well, if you want to check out his Twitter feed, and he's written about this recently, that there was an assumption that the Biden team was just going to try to re-enter the JCPOA. And I think they've been less than unequivocal in saying, we will come back in the deal, compliance for compliance. We will return to compliance if, you know, and if Iran returns to compliance. And we talked about the sequencing issue, but the reason that's important is, one, that's your best shot of just getting in the deal, right? And I think that the U.S. should be willing to return to compliance first. And then if the Iranians don't comply, then you can pull back out. But secondly, even just diplomatically, if the U.S. indicates that they're prepared to go back into the deal and comply with the deal, then the ball's more in the Iranians' court than it is right now. Because all the U.S. has said now is we want to have these talks about, you know, about returning to the deal. You know, if it really is the case that the Iranians can't get there, well, test the proposition and test it in front of the world. And then it'll be clear, you know, who's responsible for not returning to the deal. So I'd just like to see a bit of a more forceful diplomatic push here to put the onus on the Iranians and say, we're willing to come back in. And that's what we're here to discuss. And if the Iranians refuse to do it at that point, well, then, you know, then you have a problem. But if you don't do that and the time ticks off the clock and there's more of this tit for tat around other issues, you could lose the window. The window could close to return to the JCPOA. And then we're just kind of back in a situation where the Iranians have a nuclear program that's creeping forward and you have this risk of escalation in the region. And you know what? You may think that you're kind of putting off Iran as a problem, but it has a way of reemerging. Events can bring it back to the forefront here. So this does bear a lot of watching here in the next few months.
Yeah, I'm worried about this window too. Okay, like every administration before us, we wanted to focus on the entire globe, but we got a little bogged down in the Middle East. So let's turn to France. Former French President Nicolas Sarkozy was found guilty this week of trying to illegally get information about another legal case against him from a judge in return for giving that judge favors, maybe another job. He was sentenced to a 3-year prison sentence. Most of that, I think, will be suspended. Sarkozy will have to stand trial again later this month in a separate case. And then there's another, even more serious case against him that dates back to allegations that his campaign back in 2007 received illegal contributions from the Libyan government. That was under Gaddafi. So Sarkozy lost his campaign for re-election in 2012. He tried and failed to make a comeback in 2016. Sarko joins a long and growing list of senior French officials who have been prosecuted, including former President Jacques Chirac. Ben, I have to say, reading about this case made me a little jealous of a legal system that actually prosecutes corrupt former presidents. I don't know if we need to call over there. Maybe we should take a fact-finding mission to Paris, get some advice. What'd you think?
Well, yeah, I had the same thought of France has a strong presidential system, right? So these are strong, huge figures in French politics, and they're not above the law. And so, maybe the U.S. Justice Department can take a glance across the Atlantic Ocean and realize that our former president is not beyond the reach of the law. I also, it's just a wild story. Like Sarkozy is such a bigger than life kind of eccentric figure, and the Gaddafi angle is fascinating because they were super cozy with Gaddafi, clearly, too cozy. And then Sarkozy actually led the charge to go to war against Gaddafi. He was like out in front of that whole effort. And then, of course, that's the thread that started to unravel all these corruption charges. And he's got the whole story. He's married to Carla Bruni, the actress, singer, celebrity, whatever you want to call her. It's got all the makings of a great made-for-TV movie or podcast here. But I mean, I think the broader lesson here is French politics is a rough place. But kudos to the French justice system for following these things for years and not seeing anybody's above the law.
By the way, any studio heads out there, any executive producers, I know I have a writer friend who has a real expertise in politics and some high school French.
Yes. I mean, if you don't, you can pick up Babbel. No, I'm kidding. These are the kind of stories you need to get told, Tommy.
Yeah, get that pitch in good shape. Let's get it out there. Let's talk about El Salvador. Nayib Bukele is the 39-year-old president of El Salvador. He was elected in June of 2019, and a poll taken back in November found that he had a 96% approval rating. That is like Putin, Kim Jong-un, rigged poll type numbers. Bukele started a new political party, New Ideas, in 2018. He has accrued a remarkable amount of political power in a very short period of time. He's the first president in recent Salvadorian history who didn't come out of either the right-wing Arena Party or the left-wing FMLN party. He ran on promising to root out corruption and reducing gang violence, and there's some evidence that he has reduced the homicide rate pretty dramatically. I don't really know why exactly, but there's statistics out there. Bukele's party and his allies just won a supermajority in El Salvador's legislative elections, which means that they could control almost all of the government. Now, this has greatly worried human rights advocates and apparently the Biden administration, if you believe background sources and news reports, because Bukele has been willing to use the military to pressure the legislature. He literally stormed troops in to try to force a vote at one point, which is scary. He has, called his critics traitors. He's attacked the media, which is reminding a lot of people of El Salvador's pretty recent history as a military dictatorship. So Ben, the Trump administration loved authoritarian leaders of all stripes. They loved them in Latin America. They loved them in Egypt. They love them everywhere. But, the Biden administration has talked about his plan to strengthen and renew democracy in Latin America specifically. How worried do you think they should be about this? Because, when I was researching this segment, I saw some polling that found that satisfaction with democracy generally among Latin Americans has dropped from like 44 points to 24 points over the last decade. Lots of leaders in the region have used the military to bolster their image during times of crisis. You can look at Brazil, a bunch of other places. How worried are you about this potential, autocratic turn in El Salvador and maybe the broader region?
I think it's something to be worried about. I mean, I should start by saying, I understand the impulse in El Salvador, the frustration with political elites. I was thinking when we talked about this issue, Tommy, we went to El Salvador in 2011, and the president at that time was a guy named Mauricio Funes, who was also from outside the political establishment. He'd been like a TV journalist, and he entered through one of the traditional parties, but people were hopeful that, there was such frustration with corruption and elites and gang violence and corruption between the gangs and the government that people were hoping that this guy could be something different. And of course, that ended up being dashed hope over time. And that was 10 years ago. And there's just a horrific gang violence and grinding corruption in the country. And so you can understand why people are like, anybody who's different, like I want someone who's just outside the political establishment, someone young, someone different. Yeah. You have to understand the mentality of the El Salvador electorate, if you will. That said, there has to be an effort what the U.S. is trying to do, what the Biden administration is trying to do, just to channel that energy, into institution building and not into kind of one man, one rule or one man in the military rule type approaches that in the long run, that kind of cult of personality tends to lead to pretty bad places that are not just undemocratic, but they end up being corrupt and they end up being the thing that people didn't want in the first place. And so I think from a U.S. policy perspective, but not just the U.S., like the Americas, like what people should be focused on across the Americas is trying to strengthen institutions to be less corrupt and to be more responsive to people. And even if a charismatic leader comes along, that the energy of that charismatic leader is directed to making the institutions work more effectively, reforming the institutions, not just saying, screw it, I'm going to work with the military outside of this. Because that leads to bad places everywhere, including Central America.
Yeah. And also, I should just note that I am well aware of, ashamed of some of the history in El Salvador, the way the U.S. has, helped foment civil war.
Death squads.
And I was watching some interviews with Bukele, and he was talking about how, one of the reasons they have such a big MS-13 problem is because the U.S. started deporting MS-13 gang members back to El Salvador, who set up shop down there, right? So like we are a piece of the puzzle here.
And we sell guns. They come up to the U.S. to buy guns, or they smuggle guns from the U.S. down. We're part of the problem. But we're also I think we have to think of, people think of Mexico a lot. Like we are very intertwined with El Salvador, the number of Salvadorians and here in LA, we're in the DC area where I used to live. And a chunk of the El Salvadoran economy is the remittances that people in the U.S. send back down there. Obviously, a lot of the stuff at the border emanates from El Salvador and Central America. So in the long run, we have an interest, a responsibility, a moral responsibility to stay engaged and try to help solve some of these structural problems in countries like El Salvador, for self-interested reasons, right? Because if you want to stop enormous floods of unaccompanied children coming to our borders, for humanitarian reasons and for secure border reasons, if that's your perspective, well, the only real way to do that is to address the underlying causes, some of which we helped create, that are facilitating that kind of migration. So there's all kinds of reasons for the U.S. to really stay engaged here, and it's not easy. But what it takes is sustained effort, 5 years, 10 years, bipartisan, which is always hard, support for the kind of, assistance and engagement and relationships that help, again, strengthen institutions to be more effective, so that people don't think that the only recourse is to just turn to some guy who's going to grab the military and impose his will.
Yes, agreed. So I want to do a quick update on Ethiopia. We talked a couple times last year about the beginning of a civil war in Ethiopia. To catch you up, like in November of last year, the Ethiopian central government declared war on fighters in a small northern province called Tigray. Tigray is home to about 6 million of Ethiopia's 110 million residents. The central government, led by the Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, has long-standing tensions with leaders in Tigray. They're part of the Tigray People's Liberation Front, or TPLF, and he started attacking targets in that region. So Prime Minister Ahmed claimed he was acting in response to a TPLF attack on a government military base. We don't really know. When the fighting started, the central government cut off electricity, they cut off phones, they cut off internet in the area. So it was very hard to get information out about what was happening. There were some disturbing initial reports even last year about hundreds of people being killed in the fighting. Now, after several months, reports are starting to trickle out about mass atrocities, including at Ethiopia's most sacred Orthodox church, where the deacon there says he believes that 800 people were killed in that surrounding area in just one weekend. I've seen estimates that over 2 million people may have been displaced. What makes these reports especially jarring is that the Prime Minister Ahmed, won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019 for cutting a peace deal with Eritrea, Ethiopia's neighbor. Now there is considerable evidence that Eritrean soldiers were working with Ethiopian forces to hunt down these local militias. And those Eritrean forces are accused of some of the worst war crimes and atrocities. The president of the TPLF accused the central government and Eritrean allies of genocide. Biden's team, led by Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, has been publicly and privately pushing Prime Minister Ahmed to end these hostilities. Ben, there's also concern about the violence spilling over into places like Sudan, destabilizing the entire Horn of Africa. Are you seeing enough engagement from the international community to address what's going on here? Because it seems like we're just beginning to see how bad it actually is.
Yeah, and to the backstory, Tommy, you weren't around, but after the midterm elections in 2014, heading in the last 2 years, in kind of a cheesy Ted Lasso way, Dennis McDonough, who's the White House chief of staff, handed out stickers that said "Fight Cynicism" to everybody in the White House. But because the reason I say that is like, man, it's cynical if you look back, because I, like everybody, like the people who gave Prime Minister Ahmed Nobel Prize, thought it was great when he ended the war with Eritrea.
Me too.
But the cynicism is, was that all part of the play to set up, working with Eritrea to go into this area of northern Ethiopia, where he could, take on his political opponents who also were Eritreans? I hope not, but it's hard not to calculate that there was a pretty cynical bargain behind all this. The Biden team has been, like, what I like about what they've done is they've been outspoken from the transition. They started talking about this, clearly getting more engaged. I think what's necessary now is to really involve the international community, and the UN is the right venue to try to do more through the UN, through the Security Council.
We're the president of the council this month.
We're the president of the council this month, so this is a good issue. Linda Thomas Greenfield was the Assistant Secretary of State for Africa. She definitely understands the dynamics here. So I think that there's an opportunity this month for the U.S. to really push this at the UN, push this working with the African Union, which is based in Ethiopia. And yes, to both, try to first and foremost, put an end to this fighting, and try to channel some of this into a political negotiation. But yeah, if need be, to look back at is there accountability necessary? The U.S. is often at odds with the International Criminal Court. Trump sanctioned the ICC.
People are wondering why Biden hasn't pulled back on those sanctions yet. I meant to prepare that for today, but just ran out of time.
Yeah, but the reason not to attack the ICC is it's the place that you would refer, investigations of this sort. But the UN can do them too under their auspices. So that's what I'd look for next. Is there a multilateral effort that can be launched, maybe through the UN? And there already is activity. I don't want to suggest that's not going on, but kind of amp it up.
Sure.
to
and
try
Biden
to get
called President Kenyatta of Kenya as well, too. And I think mentioned this in the recap.
The Biden team, I think, has been they've been good on this. They've been on top of it. They've been vocal about it. They've signaled it's a priority. So I think they've done the right thing. I think they now have another opportunity with the Security Council presidency to continue taking that to the next level.
Yeah. Two more quick things before we get to the interview. So last week, for the first time since 2003, India and Pakistan announced a ceasefire in the disputed Kashmir region. This is clearly great news, right? Two nuclear armed countries that have been in a low-grade war for decades. And that cross-border fighting over the 400-plus mile border in Kashmir increased significantly in 2020. There were lots of shots being lobbied back and forth. Last year, we also saw Indian forces in the Kashmir region getting into fights and standoffs with Chinese troops. So lots of reasons to be happy about a ceasefire, even if it's a bit precarious. But it was, how often do you get a breaking news alert like this about India and Pakistan, or something like any sort of regional conflict where you are surprised in a good way by that outcome? I was very excited.
It's a good outcome. And look, I think people, I used to always think when I was in government, like, what are the worst case scenarios in the world? And an India-Pakistan war that could lead to a nuclear exchange was usually in the top of the list. And so anything that makes that less likely is very welcome. It doesn't address some of the other issues in Kashmir, like the Indian government's repression there. That's a separate matter. But in terms of the India-Pakistan risk, this is positive. And what you'd hope is that there can be continued dialogue between India and Pakistan and continued kind of normalization of their relationship, which is going to be hard given the nature of the two governments. But this is at least a positive step in the right direction.
Yes, agreed. Finally, last thing, our friend Mike Pompeo spoke at CPAC last week, the right-wing, nutty, conservative political meeting. I watched it because I'm a masochist, Ben, and because it's funny to me that Mike Pompeo thinks he's going to be president. I want to give you and all the listeners just a little taste of how Pompeo's speech went down with the audience. We'll play a clip.
So first, we show up Paris Climate Accord. It was a job-destroying joke, so we said au revoir.
Do you hear that? Do you hear that raucous applause from 1,400 MAGA? Au revoir.
Here's what I don't understand. I mean, there's so many things I don't understand about Mike Pompeo. But like, I honestly don't. I can't understand how there's any human who looks at that and is like, that's an appealing politician. Like no charisma, clearly completely full of himself. Like even in the Republic, like Donald Trump, like there's an appalling human being and a horrible fascistic autocrat. You could see why people watch The Apprentice, though. Like you listen to Pompeo there, like who's the audience for that joke? Like who's sitting there like, oh yeah, that's the guy I want to see at the podium. This is why, like I said to you, Tommy, like they did the straw poll of CPAC and he got 1% among that group of nutcases. Like, so when I see people talking about like Mike Pompeo getting ready to run for president, I'm like, good luck with that, buddy.
Yeah. Even in the poll they did without Trump in it, Ron DeSantis, governor of Florida, resting dumbface Ron DeSantis, got like 5 or 6 times what Pompeo got. Kristi Noem beat him. Donald Trump Jr. beat Pompeo. Pompeo tied with Ted Cruz in a poll of CPAC attendees that didn't include Donald Trump. That is not good. I don't think the Abraham Accords is your path to victory here, buddy. Your idiot MAGA friends are busy today talking about Mr. Potato Head, Dr. Seuss. It's like all culture war shit. And Pompeo's trying to get back into that, swim in that stream, but he's just, I don't know, maybe he's not good at it.
And like his Twitter feed, which I became more familiar with when he libeled me, is basically a series of bizarre assertions of the historic success of his tenure as Secretary of State. And like, I don't think anybody believes that except Mike Pompeo. I don't even think that like Jared Kushner, the other world, because not only do people not believe it, like nobody gives a shit, Mike. Like there's nobody out there that's like, what does Mike Pompeo think about the issues of the day? Or, gee, I really think Mike Pompeo is going to go down in history as Mike, like just you're going to be in the C-list speakers list at CPAC behind like Louis Gomar or whatever the fuck that
Gomer,
yep. Yeah, like that, like you're behind that guy in line because like you're just in the crazy people's line over here. So
you're the Eric Trump of the CPAC crowd. You're no one even wants to see you. Joe Biden just tweeted, "Now with our efforts to ramp up production, we'll have enough vaccines for every American by the end of May." How about that?
Yeah. I love it. I love it. And I have to say, like, for the Biden people, like, to the stuff we were talking about earlier, like, they're thinking, and this is an important, we should talk about. I mean, like, they're probably thinking, I remember the beginning of our administration, it was like, we got to save the global economy.
You're just huge with shit.
And so they're thinking, like, we got to get COVID right. We got to get these vaccines distributed, and we got to pass a COVID relief bill. And some of the reason why is there's a bit of like a tentativeness on some of these other things is probably because of that. I understand the mindset of that, even if I think they should still be more forceful on pursuing nuclear deal with Iran and consequences on Saudi. But that's great news on COVID, and they've been great on COVID in general.
Yeah, they have. Thanks to Joe Biden for apparently getting us all vaccines by the end of May.
Bizarrely, like, thanks to Johnson and Johnson and Merck. I mean, and don't worry. Like Red Roses, I get the evils of big pharma. Like, I do. Kidding. I'm just like, let's all root for them to get these vaccines out.
So, some guy I really like tweeted like a virtue signal tweet that was like, if Fauci appeared before you and said I could vaccinate you or X number of random people before you, like, what's the number of people that would be required for you to forego your own vaccine? And I was just like, buddy, are you kidding me? I would stick that thing in my arm and dump the rest on my head like a Gatorade cooler. I am so desperate to get this vaccine in my arm. I can barely even, I'm jumping out of my skin.
Yeah, no, me too. I will say, like, because there's been some great reporting here in LA about, there's kind of three ways to get the vaccine, right? Like, one is just kind of wait your turn in line, and when it seems like you've been called to show up.
Yeah, I've been choosing that way.
It's
not going so well for me.
There's another way where you like kind of hack the code for like the site you're not supposed to be at, and you go get a vaccine.
Some cheating going on.
And the LA Times has done some good reporting on that out here. There's another way though that's interesting to me ethically, which is like just the surplus vaccine at the end of the day thing, which actually
I think that's good.
I think that's totally good, and because you know what, if they're gonna if it's use or lose, if it's basically like they're going to throw out some vaccine. And so what I hope they do is communicate, more clearly, like, hey, we expect, because it seems like we're about to reach a point where there's more and more vaccine. I mean, like armchair, we've all become armchair experts on this stuff, right? So I don't want to suggest I know what the fuck I'm talking about. But like, it does seem like we're reaching a point where in some cases, supply may actually outstrip the targeted demand. And in that case, like, throw up the bat signal, man. I'll be there waiting for the excess vaccine.
There's got to be a better way than just like waiting outside of CVS. But
exactly,
I digress.
Exactly.
Yeah, I'll do it anyway. Just tell me where to go. Okay, that's it for us this week. Talk to you guys next week.